And now, without any further ado, it is a distinct pleasure and honor to welcome a dear friend of mine who has been, as much as anybody else, the model for my humanism. And I don't know if there's much more I can say than that. As I see a nice little smile and a tear over here on her face. Callie Wright has been really instrumental to my own activism, and I don't get to see her very often, and it's such a great pleasure. So at this point, I'm going to welcome her up to the podium here till we get the computer switched out.
Made a joke slide to make sure that it actually works. So my name's Callie. I host a podcast called Queersplaining. It used to be called the Gaytheist Manifesto, if anyone is familiar. You live in the podcast world. So I started playing roller derby about a year ago. And when I tell people I play roller derby, I usually get two common responses. The first one is, does that mean you like clothesline and punch people and shit? And the answer is no. No, we don't clothesline and punch people and shit. The rules for derby are actually really, really complicated around like what constitutes legal contact and what's illegal. It's a super violent, like brutal sort of contact sport, but there are rules, right? And this leads me to the next most common thing people say. And people say, gosh, I bet that's a really great way to relieve stress and get your frustrations out, right? And surprisingly, the answer is kind of no, it's not. Really. It does help relieve stress, but that's mostly just because if you're worried about something, roller derby requires so much of your concentration that like when you're on the track, you kind of have to leave what's going on outside. A lot of people are actually really surprised to find out what a cerebral sport roller derby is. It's kind of like football, right? Like if you know nothing about American football and you watch it, it looks like just a bunch of guys like beating the crap out of each other, right? And like trying to get a ball across the field. But if you know something about American football, you know there's a ton of strategy involved. It's more than just violence, right? And roller derby is like that. What's really unique about roller derby is that there's a lot of strategy. So let me give you a super basic rundown, okay? So you have 5 people from each team on the track. The people with the stars are the jammers, and these are the blockers. And the idea is both jammers are trying to get out of the pack, and you score points by lapping the opposing team, right? I promise this matters to my talk. And so what's unique is that because both jammers are scoring at the same time, you're playing offense and defense simultaneously. And that makes things mega, mega complicated because you're trying to score points and prevent the other team from scoring points. So if you focus on too much of one versus the other, you might end up failing at both. So regardless of how you play, you have to at least stay very aware of the situation that you're in and be ready to switch things up at a second's notice. And so this is how roller derby is actually a lot like activism. So as a lot of times as people who push for any kind of social change, we find ourselves playing offense and defense simultaneously, right? When we play offense, for example, we're out trying to get good laws passed. We're trying to kill bad laws, trying to change the hearts and minds of the folks in our social circles. We're trying to get anti-discrimination policies passed in our workplaces. And when we play defense, maybe we're being a little more reactionary, right? So we're trying to stop people from engaging in harmful behavior. We're trying to get people to stop making misogynist, homophobic, or racist jokes. We're, when it comes down to it, kind of trying to pry the boot out of the faces of ourselves and our friends. And I think we can probably, hopefully, all agree that both of these things are important, right? They both have a role to play. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the ways that we both play offense and defense as agents for change in our communities and our social circles. No, this isn't a perfect metaphor, right? Like we could probably spend hours breaking down how this doesn't match, but I think it fits enough to make sense. And so I've sort of boiled my activism strategy down into these two focus areas. We change minds by playing offense, and we change behavior by playing defense. So I'm going to talk about offense first. In roller derby, offense can mean a bunch of different things, but when it comes down to it, the focus is I'm helping my jammer score points, and I may be worrying less about the other jammer. And in activism, I'm going to define offense as taking action to help a marginalized community get ahead, right? So again, we're talking about passing non-discrimination laws, getting your job to add gender identity and sexual orientation to its non-discrimination policy, fighting for trans-inclusive healthcare, so on and so on, right? And these are all goals, but they're big, right? And this talk was built as sort of a guide to practical things you can do in your everyday lives. So here's the connection. Your job playing offense, when it comes down to it, really is to change minds, right? Because when something comes up for a vote, when something's on the ballot, at work, in a committee, a social group, changed minds equals changed behavior, right? And there's actually a super powerful tool that I found while doing research for this, but the catch is it's also extraordinarily difficult to use. So in 2014, there was some really groundbreaking research that was published in the journal Science. And there was a study that had shown a 20-minute conversation, if conducted the right way with a canvasser, would actually make a lasting impression on a voter's willingness to support marriage equality legislation. This was before Obergefell, so that was when this was the big fight. And we all know how difficult changing minds can be, right? And sometimes it's impossible, but this study actually seemed to show a method for doing that, and it was pretty cool. And then it was exposed as a fraud, unfortunately. The guy who had done the bulk of the work on the paper had faked his data and lied about his funding sources. Womp, 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 right? So fast forward to 2016, and the people who had actually uncovered the fraud were already preparing an experiment of their own to try to replicate this study's success. And when the fraud was uncovered, instead of giving up, what they decided to do was, you know what? The idea that humans can change their mind about important stuff, that's worthy of a retest, right? So let's actually do this study. Let's come up with a methodology, and let's actually conduct this study and see what the actual data says. Has anyone here done canvassing before, like door to door? Okay, so normally there's a bit of a conversation. You throw some statistics out, you make your case, you ask for action, that kind of stuff. And in this experiment, they sent canvassers out, and they tried something a little different. They had people engage in what they call deep canvassing. And what they did was they asked a question. They encouraged a person to think back on their own lived experience and reflect on it in a way that connected with their goal. In this case, it was to get people to vote in favor of adding gender identity as a protected class in a non-discrimination law. And I'm going to show you a video of one of these conversations. In the context of a talk, it's kind of long. It's like 8 minutes. But it's also something that I think is really mega important and worth seeing. So yeah, check this out.
And to be a little bit more specific, if we were on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is you're 100% against, 10 is 100% in favor of including them in the non-discrimination laws, and 5 is somewhere in the middle, and then you have your whole scale there. Where do you think you'd put yourself?
6.
6. Okay. What would be a reason you would vote for it, and what would be a reason you wouldn't vote for it?
What would be the reason I would is because I'm not judgmental. It's
Sure.
Everybody has their own preference.
Sure.
There's no reason why I wouldn't vote for it, but I wouldn't want that around children.
Mm-hmm.
People could pretend to be and go after our kids. I mean, that's something big to think about, and that probably would change a lot of people's minds.
Do you know someone who is
Yes,
transgender?
I have someone in my family.
So is transgender?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. How are you related to them?
It's my nephew.
Your nephew? Or
Niece, whatever.
Niece. Okay. Okay. So she.
He was born a boy, but he wants to be a girl.
Okay. How much has she talked to you about that at all?
Actually, that's funny because he felt like I'm not quite comfortable with it, so he stopped talking to me because seeing him with the wig, with the hair and the lipstick, and it's hard when you when I raised him when he was a baby, he was a boy. But he felt like I don't accept it.
Right. Do you know why they feel that way?
I don't.
Right.
That's something I would want to know because, like I said, I don't try to judge anybody. Their preference is their preference.
So your niece, what name is she asking you?
That's another thing. His name, and the name that he's going by is.
I have a friend who was in kind of a similar situation, I suppose. So this is my friend on the left. One of my best friends. Great guy. And he is transgender, so he was born a girl. He was raised as a girl. And, I think what's really important was that it really, it wasn't his body that mattered so much. It didn't matter what his body looks like. He's still definitely a boy. But he really wanted his body to reflect that and to feel very real to him. And he got his chest flattened. And he was really excited about it. He took a bunch of selfies of himself with his flattened chest. He sent a picture back to one of his best friends from high school, and she said, she just wasn't expecting it. And I think it really caught her off guard, and she said, oh, what? That's really weird. And he had been so excited about that surgery, and it really hurt him, I think, to hear his friend react that way.
Wow. Maybe that's the way I kind of reacted towards him without saying it, but the way I guess I was acting. As if it's like, don't come around me, that's really weird.
I couldn't, honestly, no one in
now
my
you make
family...
me feel bad because...
No, I'm definitely not trying to...
I
think it's really complicated.
I didn't even think about it like that, like, if I was in his position. It's kind of hard to, I never thought about it that way.
I'm wondering, is there a time that you ever kind of felt like you were on the receiving end of that? Like, when you ever felt different?
Not really. Mine is totally something else. But
no, that's totally fine. I think we can all relate to that feeling of being judged.
Oh,
so I think that's really relevant.
All the time.
What's like maybe a specific time?
Maybe a couple years ago, when I first moved out to LA. Got a lot of bad vibes here and there and there and there. It totally make you feel like you're alone or...
Yeah. What were some of the things that happened?
Well, with this workplace that I work at, I don't really want to go into details about that, but because I'm from somewhere else, some of the girls I feel like were like didn't like me or knick-knack picked at me or said things like I should go back where I was at. Yeah. So a lot of that made me feel different.
I'm really sorry to hear about that. That must have been really...
Oh, yeah.
You were just trying to start a new job?
Yeah. It was hard, especially when you have kids and, you're working to provide, to be a provider, and you're going through all that. So a lot of things were going in my mind at that time. I need the money, I need this, so I stayed longer. And suffered some of them things, but it didn't get better, it got worse.
I definitely remember, being at school, and I started I'm gay, and it was really that was an important thing for me, and I was the only one at my high school who was, so I started a gay straight alliance just because I kind of wanted to see what more was happening there. But at the end of the year, I won a senior award. It was my senior year of high school, and I got an award for it. And afterwards, when I won it, and I was leaving the gym, a group of guys came up to me and said, you don't deserve that award, you're a fag, and you only got that because you're gay, and because you started this club, and the administration feels like they had to do this for you. And so that, and it's all kind of that same feeling of they see you and you're different, and so that's how I felt, and that's how I felt when they told me about that, and it sounds like you felt that way, and it sounds maybe that way. So that's why it's really important to me that something like this law is on the books, so that people doesn't have to go to work and feel like they're going to be fired because everyone's looking at them differently or something like that.
That's true. I think that was one of the cases too. He used to go to work as a boy, and I guess he posted Facebook pages of him at work with a wig, with his hair, and I think he got fired for that. Yeah,
and that's actually exactly what this law is doing. Actually, is
okay. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. Right. Wow.
Okay.
Wow. I remember at the beginning you did mention they were talking about the bathrooms and about women and children not being safe in bathrooms. Was there something you wanted to talk?
Well, no, that's just one of my fears.
Right.
I don't judge, but that would be the one thing that I would think. Okay, well, no, that's not okay.
And I think
that would be scary,
it's and that way it's almost like comparing apples and oranges. Sex offenders are a completely different set of people from or So I mean, let's say, so before I met, I would like go to the bathroom and go in, do my business, wash my hands, and leave. After I met, we would go into the bathroom together, and same thing. We'd just both go in and do our business and wash our hands and leave. Like, it didn't change anything. You come into the bathroom with me, and that's kind of what we're dealing with here.
Okay.
Not the.
Yeah. I don't see no problem with that. I mean, he should be able to. I guess that's probably what my nephew was going to do.
Right,
He should be
I'm
able
sure.
to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Never really thought about all that like that, you know? But that makes sense.
So that could then bring you back to this rating scale. It's one last time where 0 is you would 100% vote against including transgender people in non-discrimination laws, and 10 is you would 100% vote in favor of it, and then everywhere in the middle on a scale.
I would totally vote in favor of it.
Totally vote in favor?
Yeah.
Like a 10?
Yes.
All right.
I mean, because it's only right. I mean, let a person be who they are. You know?
Right.
Hiding it is worse, so let them out.
Absolutely.
I believe that. Like, everybody should have the right to be who they want to be.
That's pretty cool, right? So tell me what you heard. Anybody? Like what did you hear in that conversation? Like, what stuck out to you?
And to be a little more specific, if you were on a scale from 0 to 10.
There we go. That's the right slide. Yeah.
He was really focused primarily on validating her experiences and empathizing with her experiences versus trying to, quote unquote, push anything on her. He was just really focused, and he was focused on bringing in perspectives of people she knew and people he knew to make personal connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He made it personal and listened, and created opportunities to connect the issue to her personal life, as opposed to dumping all these statistics, dumping all these facts, which, while there is truth, people will argue those to the end of the day. When it comes down to it, it's how someone feels, and if you can connect that to something personal like her niece, that changed her opinion. I mean, granted, she was already kind of on the fence, but it pushed it from, oh, I'm all for this, but to a solid advocate.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
So what always sticks out to me is she seemed like a very open-minded person, and she even said that she was.
Mm-hmm.
But the big thing that she mentioned was the bathroom thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think that the haters, the other side, whatever, the haters have done such a good job of blowing that issue up and making parents, and anybody, afraid for their children. And we need to do a better job of negating that. I think that
Yeah.
for people who are really open-minded even, they still come up with that.
Yeah, fear-mongering is cheap and easy, and unfortunately it works. So I'll tell you what stuck out to me. So the first thing is that he spent most of his time asking questions, right? So there were a couple of times that he related stories, but he was really asking her questions about her and her experiences and her thoughts and her views. So he was really pulling from her instead of pushing, right? And the other thing is that he validated her experiences. And this one was kind of easy because she had something that was like, yeah, like I was at work and I felt othered because I came from a different place, right? Sometimes that's not so easy to do because sometimes people will say something like, oh, I told a racist joke and someone was mean to me. And like, you don't want to validate that experience, right? Because if you told a racist joke, you probably deserve to have someone be mean to you. And then the other thing is that he told stories, right? Telling stories is powerful because we relate to stories, because we can all sort of find things to relate to, and we build characters and we build narratives. Like you were saying, instead of just throwing out facts and statistics and percentages and numbers, you make it personal. You make it. I sort of bristle at the term like humanizing trans people because that's sort of acknowledging that a lot of people don't see us as human, but unfortunately that is also the reality that we're dealing with. But it really does humanize people. That person is like me and has thoughts and feelings and experiences like me. And it's really frustrating that that's where we are as a society, that we have to convince other people of that. But that is where we are, right? And so the basic formula for conducting these kinds of conversations is pretty simple, right? You figure out where the person stands on the issue, ask a person to remember a time that they felt judged or marginalized or left out, and basically anyone you talk to is going to have something to tell you along those lines, right? You validate their feelings on the subject, and then you tie it back to the issue at hand, right? So they talked for a little bit, and they're trading stories and talking back and forth, and he said, yeah, that's why it's so important to me that this law is on the books, and that's when the connection happens, right? And notice that he still wasn't pushing, right? He said, yeah, that's why this is really important to me. He didn't say, well, this is why it should be important to you, and this is why you should do this, right? Well, this is why it's really important to me. For people and he was using names, right? Like, they blanked out the names in the video for obvious reasons, but he kept using the person's names, the names of his trans friend, of that lady's niece, right? And he made it personal. So it's like, yeah, it's like my friend, and it's like your niece, and he made it personal. And that's pretty cool stuff. And here's what's amazing about it, right? Because let's be real. That conversation was not incredibly difficult. She was an open-minded person, right? She just was very obviously missing some information in some context. When giving that information in context, she said, oh, okay, this makes sense. Obviously, not all of those conversations are that easy. So they did something like 1,100 of these sorts of conversations and recorded the results. You noticed in the video, he said, what's the number for your position before this conversation? What's the number for your position after? And that makes it measurable, right? And so the people who participated in these conversations were sent surveys at 3 days, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, and 3 months. And the researchers tried to destroy their own results. So they sent out this anti-trans attack ad. People speaking to the bathroom issue. Some of you may have seen it. It's the really, really awful, like, you're going to be sexually assaulted in the bathroom if you let trans people in, sort of attack ads. So they showed the ad to this people, sort of trying to destroy the goodwill they had built, right? And at 6 weeks, the survey responses indicated that it worked, that the support had sort of diminished, right? But at 3 months, the effect of the ad basically disappeared. And it was like they'd sort of been inoculated against prejudice, right? And across 1,100 of these conversations, there's no way they were all this easy, right? And so that's hope, right? And they had a control, right? Because they always do, and the control had to do with environmental issues. So the relative change in opinion between the control group and the experiment group was pretty close to the change in opinion about gay people that took place between 1998 and 2012. So that's 2 decades worth of opinion changing across a 10 to 20 minute conversation. That's pretty amazing, right? Now here's the other thing to consider. Because I think we all like to think that, like, oh gosh, if we just talk about these things, it works and it's great, right? But we also have to consider how difficult these kinds of conversations can be. And logistically, right, the problems are obvious. Like, you have to train people, you have to hire people, you have to build the system, build the organization, you need bodies on the ground, and you need money to pay for it all. So logistically, it's really difficult, right? But think about it being emotionally difficult, right? The guy doing that conversation there was gay, right? Imagine how many difficult conversations he had to have with people who didn't like him because he was gay. There was another story that I read about these conversations. There was a gender non-conforming person who was out canvassing as part of this work. And a man told this person, I'm from South America, and in South America, we don't like fags. And if somebody said that to me, I know how I would react, and it would probably not be friendly, right? But she just said back to him, well, I'm gay. And the conversation continued, right? And by the end of the conversation, his mind had changed. At the end of the conversation, he said, yeah, you know what, I guess I was wrong. But think about how emotionally exhausting a conversation like that can be, especially if you're having it repeatedly. Because I think about myself, and if I'm out doing this canvassing and somebody got in my face and said, you know what, I don't like trannies. My first thought would be, is this person going to kill me? Because that happens, right? So we have to consider the emotional and psychological costs of these types of conversations and making people feel obligated to have these kinds of conversations. Now, here's the cool thing. If you consider yourself an ally, there is more good news in this particular study. The survey results didn't seem to change based on whether or not the canvasser was transgender. Allies were still able to inspire this sort of change in people. And not to say that it's not draining for non-trans people and non-queer people to have these kinds of conversations, because if you're a person who cares, that's hard to deal with, right? But chances are, if you're a cisgender person talking to another cisgender person on behalf of trans people, your physical safety is a lot less likely to be in danger than it is for me, for example. And so that's good news, right? You can still trigger that sort of empathy and sympathy and compassion in that other person to help change their views. So you don't have to obligate the marginalized people in the equation to be able to accomplish these goals. So, yes?
Oh, never mind. Answered my question.
Oh.
I didn't know if your slides were off. So.
Oh, no, it's good. So that leaves me with my first call to action, right? If you want to change minds, try this conversation out. Deep canvas the bigots and the doubters that you encounter. It's a really big ask to tell queer and trans people that we should be doing this kind of stuff. So if you consider yourself an ally, try to step up to the plate and have these conversations. And try them in this specific way. So ask someone to remember a time where they felt judged or marginalized or left out. And have that conversation, validate their experience, and then tie it back to the issue, right? In that video, the guy, like we said, he didn't throw out facts and figures necessarily. He told a story about his trans guy friend. He was basically saying hey, you know what? I understand how you feel. Here's how I felt in a similar situation, and here's what I found. Try that out, formulated in that specific way, and you might be surprised at the success that you have. And so let's talk about defense for a second. In roller derby, defense is when your focus shifts to preventing the other team from scoring points. And of course, it has the same goal, right? You want to win the game, but different situations necessitate different approaches and different strategies to get there. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define defense as the more immediate harm reduction and prevention measures that we can take. And this might be a little bit more applicable to everyday life. So on an individual level, how do we prevent bad things from happening? How do we stop people from being hurt? Let's say your friend from high school posts a meme on Facebook. It's an obviously photoshopped picture of Caitlyn Jenner with weirdly enlarged feet and hands, and the caption reads, "The same people who think there's no crisis at the border thinks this is a woman." And the person who posts this picture thinks they're hilarious. And let's say, because Facebook's algorithm sucks, that this post happens to come across my feed. And I see a few comments agreeing. I see a few comments from people who think it's hilarious. And then I see somebody commenting this. Now let me ask you, raise your hand if you think this comment is going to change anyone's mind about the issue.
Which comment?
Mine, yes. This comment here. Right, no one's raising their hand because something like this is almost certainly not going to change anyone's mind, yes? Now let me ask a second question, a separate question, and it's important that this is a separate question. Do you think this comment accomplishes anything? Anything at all? What do you think?
It might open the door for someone else to make a less strident comment. Somebody who wanted to comment but didn't want to be the first.
Sure.
Say this.
That's actually a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
Saying this way doesn't help directly, but it helps open that door.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you got?
It's just reacting and letting out the frustration and anger. I mean, it's an attack. I mean, it's not an attack on me. Mm-hmm. But it's attack on people I know and people I care about. So yeah, this is like just saying, somebody walks down the street and yells something out of a car. Are you not? I mean, most of the time you're going to yell back. You're not going to get engaged in a discussion. And Facebook is really like drive-bys. Mm-hmm. So this is just
that's a great analogy.
So this is just you're letting it out.
Yeah. I saw your hand, I think.
I think it legitimizes his feeling, and I think it solidifies it. And the person that wrote showed the first meme is he's feeling that he did his job. He's feeling even more against this.
Okay. So the important thing to point out is that does this comment change someone's mind, and does this comment accomplish anything, are two separate questions, right? Because again, I think we all agree, right, that commenting like that is very unlikely to change anyone's mind about anything. But as to whether or not it accomplished anything, I think that question actually needs to have a deeper look taken at it. Now, I have pretty carefully curated my Facebook feed so that usually the only time I see something like this is when someone is sharing it to mock it or make fun of it or talk about how ridiculous it is. But every once in a while, people slip through the cracks, and I see someone who posts something like that in a serious way. Sometimes it's someone by someone I cared about or somebody who I thought was a friend, and I will tell you, as someone who is a target of that kind of thing, that comment does accomplish something. It lets me know that I have allies. And it lets me know who is willing to accommodate the bigotry and who is not. It makes me feel less alone, and it reminds me that in a world swirling in transphobia, that there are people who are willing to stand up and fight it. Now, obviously, you don't have to do that by cussing someone out, right? That's an extreme example. But the point is you are denying someone's social validation for that comment. And especially if it's someone who is close to that person, it lets me know that the comfort of the bigots in your family is less important to you than justice and equality. So obviously that's online, right? And that's its own world that we can talk for hours about. So let's take it into meat space for a second, into real life. So when I started my last job, I was terrified. So it was the first time that I was Callie at work. And I had actually lost my previous job for being trans. That's a whole different story. No one in there had ever known me by any different name or anything about my past life or anything like that. And there's comfort in that, but it's really, really freaking scary, right? And the sort of stress and fear and anxiety that comes with that kind of thing can be suffocating, and it can hold you back because you can't focus on being good at your job. You can't focus on the people around you. You're just worrying all of the time about who's going to treat you badly. Am I going to get fired for using the wrong bathroom? So on and so forth. And I had a conversation about this with someone, and in very colorful language that I will tame here, he said, "I will take care of someone personally if they ever cause you problems." And he looked me dead in the eye, and he said it very seriously, and I knew that he meant it. And that was transformative. It lifted a little bit of the weight of that fear and anxiety off of me, because it let me know, even if I run into this stuff, somebody's got my back, right? And it meant that in this guy's specific sphere of influence, when I'm in the room with him, there's someone who has my back. Someone who is going to protect me if things go bad. Someone who made no claims to understanding my experience, but regardless knew that I was in a vulnerable position, and he made it his job to make me feel safe and to make me actually be safe. And so the question is, online or offline, who are you that person for? Consider your sphere of influence, right? We all have one. We don't all have podcasts or YouTube channels or whatever, but we all have spheres of influence, right? You have your social media pages, you have your house, your apartment, your social circles. Maybe you have some position of authority at your job, for example. Do the people around you know that it's not okay for you to use transphobic or homophobic or racist or sexist or ableist language around you? Do you set and enforce those boundaries even when there's not queer or trans people or people of color around? Do you enforce those boundaries regardless of who's around? When you do this, it can start to build a sort of shield around you, right? When you enter the room, it's suddenly safer for vulnerable people and less safe for bad behavior. And of course, it's not as perfect and magic of all of that, but you see what I'm getting at, right? It tilts the needle. It moves the needle. And obviously, there are risks to consider, because it's all well and good to say that you should push back against your parents when they share that photoshopped picture of Caitlyn Jenner, but if they're paying for your kids' braces or they're paying for your college education, obviously the risk calculation there gets a little bit more complicated. So I don't want to shame anyone for not yelling at your parents when they say silly things like that, but the thing is, you need to honestly consider your ability to push back in certain situations and do it when you can. So another great example, say you're at work and somebody makes a racist joke, right? And a whole bunch of people think it's really funny. Or someone makes a joke about autistic screeching, which is the new awful thing on the internet. There is power in simply not giving those things social validation, right? If you can speak up, sure, you totally should, but if you're gonna risk your meal ticket by speaking up, how about being the person in the room who's just obviously not laughing and not amused by the joke? That counts too. And another one of my favorite exercises is just sucking all of the joy out of the room by asking someone to explain the joke to you. Somebody tells a sexist joke, and you say, you know what? I don't get it. Why is that funny? And obviously, we all know that nothing ruins a joke faster than making someone explain it, right? So be a killjoy and take pleasure in being a killjoy. Stealing somebody's thunder by making him explain his terrible jokes about like how women belong in the kitchen or whatever, maybe you'll think twice about telling that joke around you again. And to sort of bring things back around, right? Like you're probably not going to change this person's mind by doing that. But what you've done is you've made the space around you safer for people who could be targets of that joke. You're not necessarily being like a savior or anything like that, but you're helping get bigots out of the way. Like at my old job, I knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was surrounded by people who had problems with queer and trans folks. But their power to act on that was stolen from them by the social environment that we were in. Enough people had spoken up to make that kind of behavior unacceptable that they knew to keep their mouths shut. And that counts. It got to the point where I would come into work every day and I knew that sexism and homophobia and transphobia, those things were not daily concerns for me. I could focus on my job. It let me get good at my job. It let me get promoted. It let me make more money. It let me thrive. And so we're not solving systemic inequality, right? But you're making life better for the people around you. And that counts. So my second call to action is to be that person for someone. You have spheres of influence, right? Everyone does. And so do what you can to make those spaces safer for marginalized people to inhabit. Don't laugh at the jokes. Push back when and where you can. Make it unacceptable to behave that way around you. So before I open up the floor for questions, I did want to point one more thing out. Now, if you consider playing offense and playing defense as activists, right, it's pretty clear that these things can come into conflict with one another. Because if you push back really hard and you set boundaries, you engage those cognitive biases, right? So like it can kind of feel like trying to balance a spoon on a calculator using a potato and coins, right? I searched a stock image site for balance, and I thought that was just like the perfect metaphor. So like, if you tell me a sexist joke and I cuss you out and call you a pig and imply that you're a terrible person for it, you're probably not going to make those jokes around me again. But I've done nothing to make you actually think differently or speak differently when you're outside of my sphere of influence. And again, there's a spectrum there, right? There's not like nothing or cussing someone out. I'm using the extremes to illustrate the examples, but I'm sure you understand what I mean, right? If I make it unacceptable to behave that way around me, there's a good chance that that person just thinks of me as just like another one of those killjoy people. And so there's a push and pull, right? I wish I had the perfect answer for this. I don't, because I don't think there is a perfect answer. You just kind of have to make a judgment call. Enforce boundaries, engage in conversation. I'll tell you, I generally sort of play these things out. And this is not a prescription of the best way to do it. This is just the way that I have chosen to do it and the way that seems to work best for me, is I consider who's in the room and who my audience is. So I have a podcast where I talk about really difficult things. I give talks in front of people. I have really hard conversations with people. And so like I have a pretty thick skin, right? I can withstand things that some people cannot. And I don't wear this as a badge of pride. Like I don't think I'm like a better person or a stronger person. It's just the way that I'm wired, right? It's the way that my personality works. And so if there is someone in the room who is going to be hurt by that, I'm probably just going to enforce that boundary and say like, no, like we're not having this talk here. You're not going to use that language around me. We're not doing that. We're done. But if it's just me or there are people in the room who are less vulnerable, I'm a little bit more willing to engage and validate and tell stories and exchange and be nice and that kind of stuff. It's just a judgment call, like I said. So before I close, I want to open the floor to questions. So trans stuff, gay stuff, podcasting, Star Trek. Those aren't the only subjects, but those are my areas of expertise.
All right, and roller derby, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Here's the thing. I've been playing roller derby for like a year. I am not an expert, so I don't want to put myself forward as someone who can answer lots of questions about roller derby.
All right, we got two rules. We're going to use the mic because it's the only way your question can get picked up for the video. Do tip it back towards you like you see me doing now, and don't hold it that much further away, otherwise it's kind of pointless to hand it over to you. And the second thing is, if you think there's going to be some back and forth and follow-up, hang on to it before you give it back, because we always have that. Someone asks a question, Our presenter answers, and then there's a back and forth dialogue, and we end up still missing 90% of it. So, who would like to start us off now that I've set such a high standard? All right. Great.
What tactics can you use at school for these?
That's great. I think a lot of these things still apply. You just have to be a little bit more careful, I think, because if like your principals and teachers have decided that you shouldn't be having these conversations, you're a little bit more likely to get in trouble. So like obviously as adults, like I pretty much always, unless I'm at work, I'm like choosing my company, right? So it's a little bit easier for me to say like, oh, this is a group of people I don't like who don't like me for being queer or for being trans, so I can just not be around them, right? Obviously in school you don't necessarily have that choice. So I think it's really the techniques are largely the same. I think you probably just have a little bit more to consider in terms of who your audience is and who is in the room and what the consequences can be for having those conversations. Do teachers at your school have those like rainbow stickers that they put on their doors, like the safe space stickers? Have you seen that?
Yeah, sometimes.
Okay, so like a good thing to do is to look for signals like that. Like people have rainbow flags hung up on their doors or in their classrooms. That's probably a safer place to have those conversations. And one of the things that I've gotten really good at is sort of like reading the room and figuring out like somebody's looking at me side-eyed when I say that. I don't know if that's a safe person. And it's kind of a survival mechanism, right? It's like, I have to know, like, am I going to leave this room safely? Am I going to leave this room and, like, cry all the way home? And so, like, looking for clues like that is super helpful and thinking, like, you know, if the teacher in the room is an ally, you can probably push pretty far, right, in having those conversations because the person with power in the room is on your side. If not, then you got to kind of tread more carefully. And in that case, I would say probably the asking questions, pulling from people, right? So like at my last job, I was a supervisor, and they taught us how to coach people and train people. And they talk about pushing versus pulling. So pushing is me telling you, you're doing this wrong, do this better, here's a bunch of numbers, here's a bunch of facts and figures, here's what you need to be doing better. And pulling is asking questions and saying like, you know, that doesn't really make sense to me, tell me more. Or, you know, how do you think you would feel? Like in this specific situation, so like, you know, how do you think you would feel if you told, like for example, a lot of something that trans kids deal with in high school a lot is being told that they have to use the staff bathroom that's on the other side of the campus, right? And just ask somebody like, how would you feel if somebody told you that you had to do that for some reason? Because you've got blonde hair or something like that, you know what I mean? Try to engage people in discussions like that, asking questions, because asking questions is non-threatening. Right? Instead of saying like, well, that's dumb and you're a bigot and you're a jerk, all of those things may be true, but doing those things may get you in trouble more than just saying like, well, you know, like, I have a friend who is trans and like, she's late to class every day because she has to use the bathroom. Like, how would you feel in that situation? And trying to sort of engage in more of that question asking because it's less threatening. Is that helpful? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool, thank you, that's a great question.
Next question, coming over to Eve.
And we've got lots of time. And I will say, while the mic is going over there, I am the definition of an open book. I am far more likely to make you uncomfortable with my answers than you are to make me uncomfortable with questions. So like, we're all friends here. Nothing's off limits. And if a line is crossed, I will politely communicate that. Not a big deal. So whatever you got, even if you feel like it may be a little impolitic or impolite, I'm here for it.
You have Star Trek up there. I'm going to switch to the new Star Trek.
Yes.
Which is called the Orville. And, in a recent episode, a woman fell in love with a robot, which was kind of interesting. And then it came down, I hate to give this away, but it came down to a point where the robots were trying to take over the universe or something. And their
always plays out that way.
robot became going with his people. And eventually, though, he came back. So it's that period of time where you think one way and then you start thinking another way. Mm-hmm. And that's a perfect example of what you were talking about.
Yeah, that's a great point. I haven't seen that episode. I was... I'm not super emotionally... I've watched like 3 episodes of The Orville, and I thought it was like good but not great. I didn't like fall deeply in love with it. And like the trans episode they had was kind of... like... It was also good, not great. Like, it had some good moments, but there were also some moments that were just like, oh, you didn't have to do that. What else we got?
Anybody else?
Behind you, Jason.
I'm going to come to Ruth and then Richard.
Okay, I'm probably going to bumble this question. I would, because I have low frustration tolerance, I don't usually argue with people I don't agree with. I just get so tongue-tied, I don't know where to start, especially when they're coming from a place of stupid or ignorance. I mean, seriously, the people that you can't get through. I would imagine having conversations like this with a bigot is extremely difficult. I would imagine having conversations like this with a religious bigot is almost impossible because they're coming from this place of Jesus is on my side. They start quoting the Bible. If you don't know enough about the Bible to argue it, they really come from this self-righteous position that this is all a sin and God is on my side. And I just wondered if you see any difference between people that are kind of indifferent to religion or the real religious people that base their bigotry on God.
Zero difference between atheist bigots and religious bigots. Zero difference.
In getting through to them?
Yep.
Wow.
Yes.
Can you explain that? Because that really surprises me.
Well, a lot of it comes down to the self-righteousness that you were talking about, right? People who were religious for self-righteous reasons don't necessarily lose their self-righteousness when they leave religion behind. They're just self-righteous about something different. So we were actually talking about this in the car on the way over. So a lot of times what we as atheists will criticize religious people for is feeling self-righteous because they have found some truth that they are to dispense to the unwashed masses who don't have that truth, right? And a lot of atheists have the exact same attitude about atheism, right? Like, I've figured out that God's not a thing. I now am the holder of the real, actual truth, and I have a whole bunch of peons down here that I have to now dispense this truth to. And it's, the atheist arguments against gay people and against trans people, it's all sort of like a distortion of science. And they use that sort of science the same way that religious people use the Bible in sort of cherry picking and selectively picking the things to emphasize and disagree with and throw out at you. And so no, I've found literally no difference. Aside from the fact that I'm actually a little bit more equipped to argue with atheist bigots than I am with religious ones because I don't know the Bible as well as I used to, and I know the science at least halfway decently well, so I'm at least more equipped to refute those arguments. But in terms of how deeply held the conviction is and how open-minded people are to changing and all of that sort of stuff, zero difference.
Let me come to Richard, and then I'll come back to you, sir.
Thanks for your talk. My question is, when and where did gender-based bathrooms arise as a thing?
That's a great question for a historian. Unfortunately, I don't know.
I don't think the Colosseum had gender-based bathrooms.
Well, yeah,
fact,
and I mean, outhouses
think
weren't
all
gendered,
of Rome
right?
had gender-based
Like
bathrooms.
back in the day before bathrooms were in the house and they were outhouses, I don't think they were gendered, were they?
No. So why is this a thing?
I mean, that's a fantastic question.
Why would you want to pass
honestly.
legislation about a thing that shouldn't be a thing?
Well, it comes back to fear-mongering, what it really is, right? Because there's been lots of studies done, and I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but most people know somebody who is gay now. Like, that's a thing. And a lot of times that's pointed back to as the reason for such the huge shift in societal attitudes about gay people is that, lots of folks know a gay person now, right? Not so much true for trans people, especially, largely just because there are fewer of us. So there's lots of question marks, right? And people who want to fearmonger and use that to advance an agenda are more easily able to paint those question marks with the picture that they want people to see, because if the very first time I hear anything about a trans person is they're coming in the bathrooms to assault you, that's automatically set a bias up in my head, right? Especially if I'm predisposed to believe that I'm under threat, which you can look at the research that's done on conservatism, and a lot of conservatism is based on threats and fear, and who I fear is coming after me, my wealth, my whatever. And so Here you have a new group of people to fear, a group of people you've probably never met an individual who is a member of, or if you have, you haven't realized it. And so it's just very easy to paint your own pictures into question marks than it is to fight against, like, well, I have a trans friend. You're not going to convince me she's a threat to anyone. That's a lot harder of a thing to fight. And so they're being a little bit more proactive. Like, here's a question mark, here's a gray area. Lots of people don't know anything about it. And so we're more able to fill it in with what we want people to think. So, that's my read of it anyways.
So there's a corresponding question, okay? And the question is, when did homophobia become a thing? Were the Romans homophobic? Are the Vikings homophobic? I don't know. But it's a good question. Mm-hmm. When did that become a thing?
Yeah,
and do we need legislation to protect
that's a great question. Yeah.
That shouldn't be a thing.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Like, I mean, historically, I don't honestly know the answers to those questions.
It seems that, if you're going to come up, you should get those answers out for me, because I really would like to know.
Oh, so I should change the entirety of my life to be about history, just in case you're in the room.
Well, it just has to make sense,
Well, here's the thing. Knowing the answers to when it happened historically and why it happened historically really doesn't change anything, I don't think. Like, I mean, it's cool to know those things, right? But it doesn't really change the context of the society that we live in now. Because if I go up to somebody who is trying to convince me that I'm not allowed to use the women's restroom, if I go, well, here's a history book that shows this wasn't a thing 500 years ago, do they care? It's a thing now, that's all they care about. So I would push back and say that I don't think that really matters in terms of activism. It's a good thing to know, because it's cool to know facts and it's cool to know history, but I don't think it really makes all that much of a difference in terms of activism and changing minds and behaviors and that kind of thing.
It does make a difference if you're an employer.
I don't think it does, because the idea is, how are things now? We're dealing with the societal context that we live in now. If I can argue that the Roman Empire was cool with gay people, why does that matter to HR?
Well, it matters if there's legislation. If there's legislation designed to protect a particular class of people, then an employer has to look at that class of people and treat the employment situation differently. You cannot afford to hire someone you can't fire. So it's really important not to distinguish if you want to have free employment, if you want to have employment at will, if you want to be able to leave a job whenever you want. Otherwise, you're a slave. So
I'm not sure I follow. You said not to distinguish. I'm not sure what you mean there.
If you legislatively distinguish among people, mm-hmm. then an employer examining the choice between hiring someone who is protected by a particular class versus someone who is not, who they can actually employ and fire if they don't work out, they will choose that person.
Where do you put your sexual orientation on your resume?
I don't have a resume for that. I'm an employer.
I don't either.
So
what I'm saying is, I think you're probably fixating on wrong things. I don't put my gender identity or my sexual orientation on my resume. Not something I talk about in my job interviews. So I think you might be focusing a little bit on the wrong things, if that makes sense.
What if the person is black? What if the person is... Obviously, we don't employ ugly Texans who smoke. It's not a protected class. Okay? It should be not a protected class is the best thing.
So I want to be clear and make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying. So, like, using race as an example, you're saying that if black people are a protected class, as an employer, you are less likely to hire a black person because you know they're harder to fire.
I have to evaluate that situation, yes.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because I can't afford to have people working for us who don't produce.
Are you going to fire them because they're black?
No.
Then why does it matter?
You tell me, would you allow yourself to be placed in a situation where you have more or less control, especially if it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars?
I'm not going to fire someone because they're black or gay or trans, so it wouldn't matter to me.
Okay.
What if you fire them because they're incompetent and they sue you?
Yeah. What if they...
That's what he's saying. I don't agree with it, but that's what he's saying.
Right. Do you understand how difficult it is to prove that sort of thing?
How difficult it is?
If you
we had
because
a black
guy
in Ohio from us. What do you want?
Because in Ohio, it is legal for an employer to look me in the face and say, you're trans, I don't like that, you're fired.
Exactly.
Like, that's legal.
Exactly.
And if...
You
now, in
think
theory,
that protects people? I'm just asking. Do you think
I know for sure it does.
Well, it appears to.
I mean, it protects people that... passing laws that make it illegal to do that do protect people, is what I'm saying. Because in theory, if that happens to me, there have been court cases that have been judged to say that, like, firing someone because they're gay, firing someone because they're trans violates Title IX, right? Because it's gender-based discrimination. But, like, I'd have to hire a lawyer to fight that. I don't know about you. I can't afford a lawyer. So, like, I don't really have a choice. Great. That's awesome. That means you have extraordinary power that I don't have. So why are you afraid of me?
I'm not.
but you seem to be.
I've just asked you to reflect on the historic accuracy of
right, but I don't think
bathrooms.
I don't think it matters. Is the thing. Like I said, cool to know. I don't think it really matters to the current context that we're in.
I'm good.
Should it matter how old you are? I mean, that's another. No.
No, we're all old.
All right, let's let the person with the mic. We'll have brunch after this, and we can have those talks.
I have a question. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice.
Oh, you're fine.
One of the things that really troubles me is atheism and what it is about people who would make a kind of issue out of disbelieving in something that they don't believe and that you can't prove one way or the other, which just seems to me that you would dismiss this and move on.
You're saying the focus on atheism as a thing, right? Yeah. Like, we're organizing around atheism, we're talking about atheism. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that's what you're saying that you have an issue with?
Yeah,
okay.
Organizing something that doesn't exist and you don't believe it exists. The second thing I have to say is about religion and all of the negative things that we say about religion, and I'm speaking specifically of Christianity. There certainly are a lot of negative things, but Christianity has a platform for dealing with social problems, for people who need help. And it's an extensive program, and it's worldwide. And it seems to me that the people I know that are part of that program are very much into Christianity, and what they believe is what allows them to continue on that program. Now, if we didn't have those programs, just for example, in Bethlehem, if we closed the Catholic schools, our taxes would rise. If they closed their work in home for people who can't afford homes, taxes would rise. So I think there's a general negative aspect to those particular things that I think is not deserved.
Okay, so there's a couple of things to address in there. I think what's really important to point out is that, like, say tomorrow, like, we close down all the churches, right? Do we really think that people who are doing work to help other people would just stop doing that if churches didn't exist? Because I think the answer to that question is no, right? I think there is a large number of people who just have an impulse to be helpful. And because they happen to be Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist or pagan or whatever, the way that they help people focuses on those contexts, right? So we're helping people because we believe that's what Jesus wants us to do. Or we're helping people because that's what the Buddha has taught us to do, et cetera, right? And so the other thing that I think we have to consider is the idea of scale, because there are just simply a whole freaking lot of Christians, and in other parts of the world, a whole lot of Muslims, right? So those groups are going to be overrepresented in every area of society, whether we're talking about people who do the helping or people who do the hurting, right? And so the question is, can we draw a direct corollary between those things? Like this person who is out helping the homeless, if I do my super best anti-theist takedown of the Bible and convince them that God's not real, are they going to stop helping people the day after? Are they going to stop helping homeless people? Are they going to stop volunteering at their community centers? And I got to say, for most people, I really think the answer to that is no. So I don't know that I necessarily draw the connection between these people are religious, therefore they do good works. It obviously matters to people in those contexts, but I think if you remove religious belief from the context, I don't know that that situation changes a lot. And the other thing that I would maybe slightly push back on is the idea that largely atheists want those things to go away. Obviously, there are some that do. Like, there are some like super hardcore anti-theists that are like, make Christianity illegal, close down the churches, all that kind of like. That's definitively not who I am as a person. My question really is like, what are you doing to help? If it's good stuff, we're probably on the same side, and the rest of the conversation is academic. If you want to talk about the reasons that I don't believe in God, you want to talk about the reasons that I'm atheist, I am down for that conversation. But at the end of the day, if you tell me you're a Christian, that tells me one very specific thing about you that tells me basically nothing else about who you are as a person, right? Because if you tell me you're a Christian, that can mean, what, like 35,000 different things? So I tend not to base too much on like Christian versus atheist, because Christian means a million different things, and atheism also means a million different things. And the idea of organizing around atheism, I will tell you in an honest way, that's something that I actually struggle with. Historically, people who band together to fight for things are people who have been excluded or marginalized from society in one way or another, right? And so you get 5 people in a room and someone's like, yeah, you know what, my parents won't talk to me anymore because I don't believe in God. And somebody's like, holy crap, me too. And all of a sudden you have a community, right? And that's valid, right? You have something that was a transformative experience for you that very obviously affects negatively the way that you navigate the world. You're going to bond with other people around that thing. And I think that makes total sense to do as far as community building. Now, community building and activism aren't necessarily the same thing, right? So if we're talking about atheist activism, are we talking about trying to make the world a better place, or are we talking about trying to convince people to be atheists? I'm going to be honest and tell you that I don't see a ton of utility in focusing our conversation on convincing people to be atheists. I had someone at a talk once where I was giving a talk about being an atheist at a queer and trans-focused conference, and somebody raised their hand and was like, so like I have a family that I'm working with. She was a social worker, and there's a kid who is on the verge of being kicked out of his house because he's gay, and all of their arguments are religious. And
excuse me, just
I would like to be able to finish my story, please. I would like to be able to finish my story, please.
I
would like to be able to finish my story, please. I would like to be able to finish my story, please.
I'm not a
I would like to be able to finish my story, please. I would like to be able to finish my story, please. I would like to be able to finish my story, please. Thank you. Yeah, I'm the one on stage giving a talk. It's a Q&A. It's not a commentary thing. So this person asked me, how do I deal with that? And she was asking me this specific question as an atheist, and sort of the implication was like, how do I convince them that God's not real so they stop acting this way? And I'm like, why would you do that? I think it's probably a lot easier to convince someone that God is cool with gay people than God's not real. It's harm reduction, right? And that makes a lot more sense to me to do than like immediately like bringing out your skeptic's annotated Bible and convincing these people not to believe in God anymore. What else we got? We got about 6 minutes left for Q&A.
Okay. We go to Barb and then Diane, and then we'll wrap up with a closing statement. All right.
Yeah. I would like to be more supportive of the trans world. I do not understand pronouns. Could you explain some of that to me, or at least give me a place I can go to research so I can actually use the proper terminology when I'm speaking to people?
Yeah, for sure. That's a fantastic question. So So like for most people, obviously pronouns are obvious, right? If like you have someone who looks feminine, you assume she, her. If you have someone who looks stereotypically masculine, you assume he, him. And obviously for trans folks, that situation can get kind of complicated, right? Especially when we talk about non-binary people, lots of folks use they, them pronouns. And so I'm a fan of asking people for their pronouns. And the specific language is, what are your pronouns? Not what are your preferred pronouns, because my pronouns are a matter of fact. My pronouns aren't a matter of preference, right? And so, what are your pronouns? And the other person says, he, him, she, her, they, them, and that's really it. So I think there's a lot made of the issue that makes it seem a little bit more complicated than it has to be, in my mind. Because really, you can just ask someone and just go by whatever they say, is what it really comes down to.
So it is an acceptable question. It won't be offensive to actually ask.
So I can tell you what you will experience most of the time. Most trans folks you encounter, in my experience, will appreciate the question. Some will be offended by the question. I am not terribly worried about the folks who would be offended by that question, because typically where the offense in that question comes from is, I've done a lot of work to look stereotypically feminine, and if you can't tell that I'm supposed to be a she, her, then you're a bigot, or something along those lines, right? I can't promise you will never encounter that, because I have encountered that as a trans person in a support group, and it made me super angry, because you can't necessarily assume someone's pronouns just by the way they look. And so, at the worst, you might encounter someone being made slightly uncomfortable because it's sort of like making their transness an open question. But at that point, it's kind of it's a calculation that you make, right? Because misgendering hurts. It sucks, especially the further and further I get into this whole thing, the more and more I get settled into life. Generally speaking, people read me as kind of a butch lesbian, right? Because I got the backwards hat and the short hair and the flannel and the side shave. I tick a lot of the stereotype boxes. And so I'm pretty used to people not misgendering me, so when it happens now, it sucks more than it used to when it was common, if that makes sense. And I would rather err on the side of a little bit of awkwardness than actually hurting someone, if that makes sense. And so really the other thing that I would encourage, and this is something that I took from Twitter, and I really wish that I could credit the person who said it. I don't remember who it was. So the idea is to integrate someone's pronouns into your idea of who that person is. That sounds really complicated, but for us, pronouns are just a given, right? I am she, her. I've had to think about that question a lot more than most folks do, right? A lot of times you can tell when someone comes out as trans, their friends and family don't necessarily integrate who that person actually is into their idea of them, if that makes sense. So for example, the video that I played, where that lady's talking about her niece, right? She had not integrated her niece's transness into her idea of who that person was, because she kept using the wrong pronouns and using the wrong name and all of that sort of stuff. So she had not actually accepted that that person who was who she reported herself to be. And it's a subtle psychological shift, but you can sort of tell the difference in your own thinking when you say oh, I have this person who I've known as Tim for 20 years of my life, and all of a sudden Tim comes out as trans and is asking me to use she, her pronouns. And the idea is to try to change your concept of that person in your head. This is not formerly Tim, now Sheila, or whatever. This is Sheila. This is who she is as a person, and I just figured this out. And when you integrate that into your head, it makes things a little bit more easy, and you don't have to worry about tripping yourself up over pronouns. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of my biggest problems was with a tenant that I had, and it was terribly uncomfortable because I honestly could not tell, and I was surreptitiously trying to look at her chest, wrists, try to get some sort of telltale thing. In the end, I finally just simply had to ask, but. I mean, it's mostly my concern is mostly for people that that I meet, cashiers and people that I meet just kind of out in the world. Obviously someone that I've met that I have contact with. that's a different story.
It gets easier when you're constantly thinking about like degendering your language and like I catch myself doing it now. I say like this person instead of assuming him or her. I say, this person. Or and a lot of us already do it, right? So think about this thought experiment. You find a cell phone outside on the sidewalk, right? You bring it in. Whoever you live with, whose cell phone is that? I don't know. I bet they really want it back. And you just like roll that off the top of your head without thinking about it, because it's already sort of a habit to use they, them as a placeholder for someone whose gender we don't know. And so like it's a thing we already do. You just have to add a little bit of context to it, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
So yeah, for sure. I think there was one more.
Yeah, I'll come over to Diane for the last question, and then we'll wrap up.
So thanks, Barb. I was thinking about that too. All the trans people I've known have been students. And it's interesting because the people usually in elementary and middle school, which is what I work with, and have to transition with the child. But anyway, that's not what I was going to ask. But thank you for asking that. So I could really relate to a lot of the stuff you said, and I'm fascinated by the study. You said 1,100 people were?
I think it was like 1,128, I think was the number.
I'm wondering if there was any data collected about the age of the person and changing their mind, because in my family, the young people are pretty open-minded and whatnot, and it's just the old people who are such bigots and racists, and it's just so frustrating. So, and if you could maybe even link, maybe Jason could post a link to that study, or I'm pretty fascinated to read more about it.
Yeah, I would be shocked if that data wasn't in there. It's not something that I looked at, and that's actually a really great call out, and it actually dovetails very nicely into the closing that I have. So.
You can see me later.
Yeah, it's great. No, it's good. So I want to show you something kind of wild. So I want to have a few volunteers. Just like raise your hand if you're willing to volunteer for me. I'm not going to embarrass you too badly. 1, 2, 3, 4. I need like 3 more. 5, 6. 1 more. All right, just come up here and stand in front of the stage for me. I'm not going to ask you to like talk in front of anybody or do anything super embarrassing. This is for illustrative purposes. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 7. Cool. 7 is what I was looking for. Yeah, you can just face the stage. This is cool. So, like, if you're a person who gives a shit about the world around you, it's really easy to get discouraged, right? We face really big problems, and there are lots of really, really terrible people out there working very hard against us. And we know there are lots of people who are on the right side of these issues, but the question that we always worry about, or at least I always worried about, is like, are there enough of us? Because you seem to have to wade through a sea of terrible people just to get to a few decent people, and it feels overwhelming. And so, are there really enough of us to make a difference? And it turns out that's a question that's been studied too. In June of last year, a study was published examining this question. What's the societal what's the tipping point for societal norms? So like, how many people have to be pushing against a societal norm for this norm to change? And they picked 10 groups of 20 participants. I'm not going to get too crazy in the weeds, but so they gave these people a financial incentive to agree to some set of linguistic norms. And once they had this norm established, they had a group of activists, quote unquote, in this group to try to challenge these norms. When a group was below 25% of the population, their efforts failed. When the number was above 25%, there was an abrupt shift in this group dynamic. And pretty quickly, these norms changed. In one trial, it was literally a single person that constituted the tipping point between social norms shifting from one side to the other. And they even tested this number by increasing the financial incentive, right? So they doubled and tripled the payments for these people to hold tightly on to these norms. But the dynamic remained. So 25%. Think hard about that. But of course, there's always an asterisk, right? And there's even one in my PowerPoint. I spent a lot of time working on that animation. I'm very impressed with myself. It's not true. I clicked 2 buttons. So even in the notes for this author's study, they point out that, of course, like real-life situations are different, right? In the study environment, we're not talking about societal norms that people have a lot of investment in. So like their religion, for example. How long they've held a belief, how deeply they hold to a belief. You might be able to convince me that Picard is a better captain than Sisko, but you're not going to convince me that trans people don't deserve equal treatment in society, right? But even still, this number surprised me. It's 25%. And these people standing in front of you constitute about 25% of this room. So think about that. Conventional thinking teaches us that we need to have some super hardcore, overwhelming majority of people to change social norms, to change thoughts and behavior. But it seems like there's at least some evidence that this isn't maybe entirely true. Maybe our situations aren't quite as hopeless and helpless as they feel sometimes. 25%. Look at this room and look at our volunteers. So we have a super long hill to climb, right? But what I would like you to leave with today is that maybe that hill isn't quite as high or steep as we might think. So let's get to work.